Happy Monday. Hopefully you're being good for the sub. Thanks for being awesome. I know you can do it. So if you haven't already done the starter, which you should have because that's the first thing we do when we come in, here's where it is. Just know the starters are always in Canvas. If you're ever absent, you can make them up here. A reminder to you, we're just getting started in the trimester. Please try and stay on top of things. The first couple of assignments have been graded. Be proud of what you do in history and take the time to come in for help or during Hero if you need to get caught up. Quick review. Now, if you already finished your George Washington notes today, you probably did a little bit of a review. But just a reminder to you that in those George Washington presidency notes, we were learning about how George Washington kind of sets up the role of president. We talked about that word precedence, in which is kind of a pattern or tradition that he sets of just what is the role of the president in establishing a new government. During his terms in office, there were decisions about whether or not there should be a national bank. There hadn't been one. And Alexander Hamilton was very much in favor of a national bank. Thomas Jefferson was opposed to it, and these two men were part of Washington's cabinet. The cabinet are the people that advise the president and help them do their job. You learned about some of the difficulties Washington faced. The Whiskey Rebellion, where farmers were turning their grain into whiskey because their grain would go bad by the time they could get it to market because they didn't have trains and planes and automobiles and all the things to get food to market, and whiskey doesn't go bad. But then they're taxed on whiskey, and that rebellion in Washington had to decide just how much does the federal government interfere. Same thing with Northwest Territory. There were also global issues, specifically the French Revolution. France had come and helped the United States out with their revolution, and now that France was having a revolution, how much should the United States get involved? After all, they had signed a treaty with the French called the Treaty of Alliance. Basically, we'll help each other out. Thomas Jefferson was very much in favor of going and helping the French. He was kind of like, they helped us, now we need to help them. Hamilton, on the other hand, was very much, no, we should remain neutral. We got our own problems to deal with. And so Washington kind of has to decide, are we going to be neutral or are we going to support the Treaty of Alliance that we signed? And basically he decided, we signed the Treaty of Alliance with your king, King Louis XVI. You executed your king, so that makes the treaty null and void. So, you know, this is kind of how things get started. It's a little bit of a rough start. Washington decides he's tired of public office. 2 terms in office was enough for him. There was nothing in the Constitution at this time that said a person could only serve for 2 terms. But he's setting a precedence. This is going to be a pattern that's going to be followed. So he announces he's not running for re-election, and when his time comes up, he gives a farewell address. And in that farewell address, he gives 2 suggestions, I guess you could say. One, he warns against getting entangled in foreign affairs. Maintain that position of neutrality. You know, stay out of other people's business, take care of your own problems, etc. He also warns against the formation of political parties. George Washington tried to remain neutral there as well. There's nothing in the Constitution that says political parties can't happen, but there's nothing that supports them either. And Washington was of the opinion it undermined unity. It divided people, which I think if you know the political feelings right now, there is a lot of division between the 2 major political parties. So pretty much as Washington leaves office and says no parties, political parties get started. We'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. Now, one of the reasons for these political parties is the way people think things should happen in the government. Now, as Washington was president, he tried to look at both sides. He tried to remain neutral. But as Hamilton would argue his side and Jefferson would argue his side, these 2 main men that helped on his cabinet, as the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasury, Washington tend to side with Hamilton more, and Thomas Jefferson saw this as favoritism, and it made him mad, so he resigns as Secretary of State, and Hamilton's eventually going to resign as Secretary of State as well. But these two men began to kind of represent the two different sides or different political parties, and when George Washington says, "I'm not running for re-election," these two political parties are going to prepare for the next election, which is going to be in 1796. Now, Hamilton and Jefferson were two very different people, and they tended to disagree about everything. And Washington picked them to be on his cabinet for a reason, because he wanted to see two different perspectives. He wanted to see multiple sides. He said, that makes me a better leader, to look at both sides, to hear different ideas. But these two men are going to become basically the heads of their political parties. So what is a political party? A political party is basically a group of people that have similar ideas and beliefs about the government. You'd actually be surprised how similar political parties are. Most people want the same thing. Most people want good health care. They want good education. They want to feel safe. The difference comes with how we come about that. How do we get that good health care? How do we get that good education? How do we provide situations that make people feel safe? And as I already mentioned, the Constitution made no provisions for political parties. It doesn't say they're allowed. It doesn't say they're not allowed. And George Washington had hoped they would not form. Alexander Hamilton becomes the leader of the Federalists. Thomas Jefferson became the leader of the Democratic Republicans. And those are a couple of your answers on your questions, so I hope you're filling them in. So let's talk about the two different political parties a little bit. The party that Alexander Hamilton was in charge of called themselves the Federalists. And Federalists believed the Constitution gave the government implied powers. The United States Constitution is not very long. It doesn't contain a lot of information. And so Federalists believed that it kind of granted powers that maybe weren't necessarily mentioned. They were very much in favor of a loose construction of the Constitution, meaning that because the Constitution is so short, it's not specific about everything, so you can look at it and interpret it in different ways. Now, the Constitution gave specific powers to do things such as issue and borrow money, but it didn't say anything about a national bank. But the Federalists were kind of like, but it also doesn't say anything about how you can't have a national bank. So that means we can have it. Federalists supported ideas of the gentry and the wealthy and wanted to see the government run by the wealthy and successful people. They kind of said, well, they're wealthy and successful for a reason. They're smart and intelligent and do good things to become successful and wealthy, so they would do good things in the government. They were opposed to popular democracy. This idea, popular democracy, is the idea of everyone being involved. They were like, no, it should be a lot of people, but a select few. And the reason for this is they were fearing that if you had too many people in government, it ruined it. They were in favor of a strong national government. They were in favor of the growth of cities, trade, business, etc. They wanted to see the national government increase in power, and they were in favor of supporting the British. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, supported by Thomas Jefferson, felt very differently. Now, the Democratic Republicans often went by Republican by short, but this is not connected to the same Democratic or Republican parties that exist today. Those aren't going to get started for a while. This was a completely different political party. So the Democratic Republican Party favored small businesses. They were mostly supported by people in the South, and the South was mostly agricultural, meaning farmers. So they were in favor of big business. they also believed ordinary people are smart enough to govern themselves. They wanted public education because they said if we educate the general people, then the general people can make smart decisions about politics. The Democratic Republicans supported the French. They were farmers and they saw farming as the way of the future. They're like, we're never going to have a time where we don't need to eat, so we need to support farms. And they also supported the states to be a more powerful government, that the federal government should be limited and small, and very much in favor of a strict construction of the Constitution, meaning if it's not in the Constitution, it's not legal. Around the same time, the number of newspapers in the United States doubles. This is how people got their information, and people were craving information. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have radio, we didn't have television, we didn't have all those things. So the way people got information was newspapers, and there were a lot of them. But you start to see papers become biased. Now, being biased isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you recognize the bias. Bias basically means like you're pushing a certain point. Bias still exists today. You're also going to start seeing what we call mudslinging. Mudslinging is when you share information about your political opponent to make them look bad, like they've got dirt on them, hence the word mudslinging. For example, you see a meme over here that talks about how news really works. You have the same story happens, but different news agencies report on it different. If former President Obama were seen drinking a soda, one news agency might say Obama appeals to Pepsi fans because he's got a Pepsi cup. Fox would say, oh, he's drinking Pepsi, therefore he's against Coke. MSNBC is saying that maybe because he's drinking Pepsi, he is saying it's the best cola and anyone who disagrees is racist. And on the other hand, you have a completely other news agency that's talking about the things that are really happening, like a drone strike in Pakistan. All right. Politics and the election of 1796 gets pretty nasty. There's decisions about which political party is going to control the House and the Senate, because remember, they're the ones that make the laws, so that's important. We have the development of party caucuses choosing leaders. And a caucus is a private meeting held by congressional leaders to decide a political candidate. The party caucus is who decides the people that are running for office. Federalists choose John Adams and Thomas Pinckney as their presidential candidates. Republicans choose Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr as their presidential candidates. Now remember, at the time, the Constitution said whoever gets the most electoral votes will become president, and the second most votes would be vice president. John Adams received 71 electoral votes, and Thomas Jefferson received 68 votes. So John Adams is going to become the second president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson is going to be vice president of the United States. John Adams is a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. Can you foresee a problem? Now, I hope you've used that information that you learned to answer the questions and submit it on Canvas. If you're interested, here is a video from Hamilton that talks about the switch from George Washington to John Adams. The title of the song is I Know Him. And then, of course, if you don't want to watch that, you can skip it. But afterwards is the song that, it's unavailable. Sorry. So just enjoy this one. Once you've finished answering the questions, submit them and then look on Canvas to see if there's anything more you need to do. Thanks for being fabulous and getting your work done.